Okay, welcome to this webinar. The title of the webinar, as you just saw on the slide, is Authenticity and Native Speakerism. My name is Robert Lowe, and
I'm Richard Pinner.
And this webinar it's based on a paper that we co-wrote, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But really, it's about the connections that we've identified between the two concepts of authenticity and native speakerism in English language teaching. So we'll introduce ourselves first, talk a little bit about our backgrounds, we'll talk about the paper that we wrote, and then we'll talk about some of the connections in theory and practice.
Yep, that's the plan.
Yes.
So I'll go first then, I suppose. So I'm Richard, as I said. I have a blog at uniliterate.com. And I'm also an assistant professor at Sophia University in Tokyo, and I'm nearly finished my PhD in looking at the sort of relationship between authenticity and motivation under Dr. Emma Ushioda at Warwick.
And as I said, I'm Rob. I'm one of the co-hosts of the TEFLology podcast, if you've heard that, or more likely if you haven't. I'm a lecturer at Tokyo Kasei University, which is where we are now.
Yep.
And I'm doing
his books.
And I'm doing my PhD on the topic of native speakerism in Japanese higher education under Professor Adrian Holliday at Canterbury Christ Church University. So, as Richard said, his focus of his PhD is authenticity. Mine is native speakerism, and you've just published this book.
I have, yes, yeah.
There we are. Which I think you began the initial exploration of the connections between these two ideas in this book, right?
Yeah, there's a section on native speakerism in there, but I would also say that I wouldn't know as much about native speakerism as I do if I hadn't have had the privilege of meeting you. So Rob's helped me a lot with that chapter, in fact, and then we realised there's enough here to kind of discuss it in a research paper. It was more of a state of the art kind of literature review, really, in the end, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Than a research paper. But I noticed actually on the TEFL Equity blog, in fact, just today or yesterday, they shared up a link to someone else who's looking at the ideas of authenticity and native speakers.
Yeah, that's Luke Lawrence.
Is that Luke?
Yes.
Oh, right.
Who is down in Yokohama. It's not too far from here. But yes, that's TEFL Musings, I think is the name of the blog, and that was very interesting, I thought.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet, because I saw it on my phone, and I don't like to read clever things on my phone, I just read stupid things. So I actually saw that on Facebook, and thought, I'll read that later. So is he talking about the same things we're talking about?
Similar kinds of things, but from a slightly different kind of point of view. So yeah, I mean, go and read it. And
so obviously, it's an area for more research, and this is kind of what we ended up concluding in the paper, that there needs to be a lot more research done into this these connections, because they potentially, it could be. I mean, we kind of think that the authenticity is one of the real kind of core kind of nucleus of native speakerism, really, in many ways. Like it's this concept of authenticity that really creates a lot of discrimination and unfair practice in the ELT industry. So we'll talk about that for the rest of this webinar.
Yes, yeah. So the paper, which it should be on the screen now, is titled "Finding the Connections Between Native Speakerism and Authenticity." It was published earlier this year, which is 2016, if you're watching this in the future, in the journal Applied Linguistics Review. And in it, we try to, as we said, identify connections between the two concepts in theory and in practice. So for the outline of this talk, we'll begin by defining native speakerism and discussing that concept a little. Then I think, Richard, you'll talk about authenticity. We'll then talk about connections in theory, so the theoretical framework that we put together in the paper, and then connections in practice, which is the practical effects of the connections between these two concepts.
Yeah, how it kind of manifests itself in practice.
Yeah. The first thing that we'd like to quickly talk about is the idea of the native speaker. What is a native speaker? So there's an image which I think you're probably quite familiar with up on the screen there.
Yeah, I recognise that boy. Well, he's actually my son. So I'm married to a Japanese lady, and when we had a child, you know, at home we speak English to my son, and then when he goes to school, he speaks Japanese. So he's quite bilingual at the moment. I'm happy to say, and you know, he has two languages basically. So is he a native speaker? You know, this is where I chose that picture. Is my boy, who's mixed race and bilingual, is he going to be, you know, prejudiced against? Is he going to experience prejudice against him if he tries to get a job as an English language teacher, for example? So you know, and I think this is where you'll come in and explain what a native speaker is, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think again we perhaps don't quite agree on this. I
disagree. I think we do agree.
Okay, all right, let's find out.
Let's find out.
So there's been a lot of research over the years on what constitutes a native speaker.
Yeah.
And
it was originally, well, it wasn't originally, but Chomsky's kind of the reason why we have this concept in some ways. Is that right?
Well, there's a few different kind of schools of thought on it. So
Okay.
A recent monograph by Bonfiglio, I think is the name of the guy, traces it much further back to kind of the ancient Greeks and around that time, and really to the construction of the idea of the nation state.
Okay.
So the idea that a particular language and a particular ethnic group and a particular tract of land are all kind of combined together. So that's where you get this idea of the native speaker, like mother tongue, motherland, and so on. But yeah, in theoretical linguistics, Chomsky is often he's kind of villainized in a way for having put forward this idea of he says the object of linguistic study is a monolingual native speaker in an environment who knows its language perfectly. And so on.
That's the ideal speaker of a language that he said, isn't it?
Well, that's not really what he said. He says that's the object of linguistic study.
Oh. Okay.
So what he's talking about there is a scientific concept, and scientific concepts are necessarily reductive, right?
Yeah.
Because you can't account for every single variable.
Yeah.
So what he's saying is within his school of linguistics, which is it's a scientific approach to linguistics, you need to have an object, a concept which you can study. So he's not talking about real speakers.
That was the key. That when I said ideal speaker, he acknowledges the fact that the native speaker is not so much a flesh and blood thing as a conceptual thing, even in theoretical linguistics.
Yeah. So my conception of the native speaker is that in theoretical linguistics, it's a model. It's an idealized model.
Yeah.
But it is a model, it's not a real thing. Whereas in applied linguistics, I say it's a social construct. So it's connected to things such as ethnicity, your homeland, your nationality, your name, even. Yeah. There's research showing that someone's name helps to identify to other people whether or not they're a native speaker or a non-native speaker of a particular language. Yeah. So I don't think it's a value-free construct. I see it as a social construct.
Yeah. So I don't know why you think I disagree with any of that.
Because you told me you did a little while ago. But if you agree, that's good.
That sounds to make a lot of sense to me.
Okay.
I can't say. So well, basically, you're saying that there's no such thing as a native speaker. In flesh and blood terms, but it's a social kind of construct, and it's a label applied to people.
Yeah, I'm saying the label that is applied is the social construct, if that makes sense.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But basically, there's no such thing as a native speaker, or as Alan Davies says, it's a myth.
Yes, yeah. Although he says it's a useful myth,
Well,
which I disagree with.
yeah, you think it's not useful.
Mm.
You think it's damaging.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so too.
Mm.
So let's move on then to native speakerism.
Yeah.
This is also your area.
Well, but maybe you want to introduce this because you took this photograph here on the.
Yeah, I should say something, otherwise you'll get all the words. Yeah, so where I live, there's a Nova, which is an English language school, a private language school, and actually one where I used to work when I first came to Japan. And it's sometimes described as like it's like a McDonald's of English language education, and the lessons are sold a little bit like fast food, and you can book a lesson at 5 minutes notice and things. And but they're very powerful. They had quite a strong presence in Japan until they went bankrupt a few years ago, but they're still around. And this photo, this is what they had in the window of the Nova where I live, and it said all instructors are native speakers, and it's saying that as a marketing point, as a selling point, as in some schools have employed non-native speakers, and that's obviously inferior to us who have only all native speakers. And I've found myself feeling quite disgusted with that picture. So I took a picture of it and I uploaded it to the TEFL Facebook page, and there was a big discussion on there about that, about the idea of native speaker or non-native speaker and this discrimination. And we've been looking. This is something we're currently researching, but we've been looking at the way that the native speaker is used as a selling point, especially in Japan where we're based. We see it all the time in adverts for language schools. The kind of image of a native speaker, and it might even just be a visual representation of a white male, usually sort of in the centre of a room, and he's obviously the teacher, as in that advert there for Shane English Schools, which it markets itself as being specifically British English as well.
I used to work there.
Yeah, you used to work at Shane, and I used to work at Nova. Yeah. So now we're criticising those former employees.
So that brings us on, I think, to the idea of native speakerism.
Yeah.
So this was it's a term coined by Adrian Holiday in 2005. Well, no, in 2003, and then expanded on in 2005 in the book "The Struggle to Teach English as an International Language," which is there on the shelf there.
We just call it "The Struggle."
Yes. Native speakerism, it's undergone something of a semantic shift, I think, in recent years, where people talk about it as a term basically the same as racism, essentially, the native speaker version of racism, to mean just discrimination against non-native speaker teachers. But I think there's more to it than that, and there are some challenges to it. So, for example, I think that contained within the idea of native speakerism is, yes, discrimination against non-native speaker teachers, but that is part of a larger ideology, in which the white Western person, presumed native speaker of English, is seen as the ideal model of the language and the ideal representative of these different institutions in the West, which are also considered to be the wellspring of the correct form of the language and of the correct methodology for teaching it. So yes, discrimination against non-native speakers is part of that, but it's an
ideology.
Well, the whole thing's an ideology. The discrimination is a result of the ideology.
Yeah.
And there has been recent work from some scholars in Japan arguing that native speakerism should be reappropriated to mean discrimination against anyone on the basis of their speakerhood. So they in the book Native Speakerism in Japan, Horton and Rivers collate together lots of examples of so-called native speakers being discriminated against in the Japanese higher education system.
Yeah.
And I think that that's correct. I think that any kind of discrimination is wrong. But again, I think the reason they're being discriminated against is a result of the same ideology. So it's the idea that these people are representatives of a particular language and a particular culture, and that's all they are. And they're not, they're not considered to be trained and respected educators. So yeah, I think it's a bigger ideology than it's considered to be. Quite often.
And I think like in the discussion that we had on Facebook about the native speakerism, and a lot of people who identify themselves as native speakers get a little bit defensive about the use of words like discrimination or native speakerism, because they see themselves as proper teachers, as career language teachers, and I think they worry that I'm not sure actually. It depends on the person, but it seemed like some of the people in the discussion were worried that they would be labelled that they would be labelled as sort of inferior teachers or not serious teachers just because they're native speakers in a way. So, and they felt that it wasn't really a problem, and I think it really needs a lot more investigation, doesn't it?
Yeah. So we've had our own experiences, I think, of native speakerism, of this ideology. There's an image here of you. Do you want to explain that?
All these pictures are my pictures, aren't they?
You made the PowerPoint.
I did make the PowerPoint. That's why. So yeah, this was me working for Nova, and I was younger then, so much easier to look at than I am now. But I was asked to pose for these publicity photos, and I think that that was one of my experiences of kind of native speakerism, that I was working for a school that says all of our instructors are native speakers, and I got the job, and so my experience was a kind of as a privilege, really. I've experienced native speakerism in a privileged way. I was able to get a job in Japan, even though at the time I didn't speak any Japanese really, and it was quite a well-paid job, much better paid than, say, some of the Japanese people that I would walk past on my way to work, whose job was sweeping the streets or something. I didn't even speak the language, and I could get a higher-paying job than those people. So that was privilege, and I enjoyed my time at the school, but I don't think it's. I have had very few experiences where I would feel like I've been discriminated against for being a native speaker. Most of my experience is of being privileged to be labelled as a native speaker, because I'm from England. Well, we're both from England, so we can easily wear the label of native speaker, although I don't really see myself as a native speaker in many ways, because in my classes now I tend to mix in a lot of Japanese. The more my Japanese proficiency rises, and I use Japanese and English in a lot of sentences when I'm speaking with other English speakers. Like when Rob and I talk, we'll talk about our kenkyuhi, or how much is your kenkyuhi, or how much have you got left of your kenkyuhi. Or
that means research budget.
That means research budget. And research budget is a longer word than kenkyuhi, and we both know the word, so we just use that.
Yeah, it's the only word we know, though.
So. It's not the only word that we use in that way, and I don't know if you would call it code switching exactly, but we have expanded our repertoire of the language to include a lot of Japanese words that normal people who don't live in Japan wouldn't know.
Yeah.
So it's a sort of exclusive or specialized type of language that we use with people in Japan. And then when I'm speaking to Japanese people, if I'm teaching a lesson, I use a lot of Japanese in that. And also I find that because I'm living and speaking a lot of, or trying to speak a lot of Japanese, that I do lose my way with English sometimes. And quite often in a classroom, I'll find that I don't know the word that I'm trying to look for in English, but I might remember it in Japanese for some reason. That's rare. That's rare, but as I get better at Japanese, it's increasing. So, I don't think you could just label me as a native speaker,
Right.
because that implies that I'm perfect at English, and I'm not at all.
I don't think anyone's perfect in any language.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem with the native speaker idea, is it implies some kind of perfection or deep knowledge.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you said that you haven't had much experience of discrimination for being a so-called native speaker.
Yes.
So I'd say that I have, but it was, I mean, my negative experiences of being a native speaker are far outweighed by the positive experiences, by the privilege. But a particular example I can think of is when I got my first university job in Japan. I'd been living in Japan for about 2 years at that time, and I could speak some Japanese, and I wanted to improve my Japanese, but I was told that when I was speaking to the students, I was to pretend that I'd just arrived in Japan and that I didn't know any Japanese, because this would give them a pure experience of interacting with a foreigner. And again, you see here the idea of the native speaker as something pure, something in one state. Which I think leads us on actually to the idea of authenticity in a way. Which I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I've had similar experiences where I'm told not to use Japanese, and you kind of I allow my students to speak English and Japanese in the classroom as long as they speak mostly in English. But I think if you speak two languages, you would naturally use them together. So you have to deny part of your identity, and that's what authenticity really is, as far as I'm concerned. It's part of our identities, and it's individual, and it's a socially constructed thing. And the existential philosophers of the 20th century were very interested in authenticity. And this is one of the things that made those people so depressed, I think, because authenticity is really, really difficult to define. And if you read about authenticity in existential philosophy, one of the quotes that I read by Jacob Gollum says that it's easier to define what's not authentic. It's hard to define what authenticity is, but we tend to define authenticity through negatives.
Right.
So you can say that's not authentic, but you can't say what is authentic as easily. Basically, authenticity philosophically, authenticity is being your true self. But also there's the complications with that, because you can never really be your true self, because there is more than one self. So there's the self of me as someone who's written a book and knows about authenticity and present. This is my professional persona which I'm presenting to you now in this video. But then when I go home, I turn that off and I turn into husband or turn into father. And when we finish this video, we'll probably go out for a meal, and we'll switch into friend mode. So you have different selves all the time. So you can't really say that you have one authentic self, because society expects you to play different roles at different times. So this is another reason. So some of the existentialists thought that there was one true authentic self, and society should accept that. And then, but then obviously you get into a lot of trouble. And then some of the other existentialists argued that there is, it's dynamic and changes. But interestingly, while all that's been going on in philosophy and in educational philosophy as well, the concept of authenticity in English language teaching tends to be, at one point, very confusing and complicated, and at the same time, oversimplified. So it's a kind of paradox, But generally, when you talk about authentic materials, we just think of something that wasn't designed for language teaching, such as the classic newspaper. And that's that is a very pervasive definition of authenticity in language teaching. And I think that's very problematic, because I call it the classic definition, because it's kind of like a classic car. it's historically important, but it's not practical to drive anymore, and it's likely to break down. And I think that it's also very dangerous, because if you talk about authentic text as a newspaper, you're not saying the word native speaker or native country or anything, but it's certainly implied. And because it's implied, it's more difficult to deal with, because no one's directly saying native speaker, they're saying real, but it tends to gravitate towards native speakerist conceptions of authenticity. And so this is why people, if let's take the newspaper example, if you want to teach an authentic text, and you've got a newspaper from the United States and you've got a newspaper from Singapore, for example, which one's more authentic? Probably people would gravitate towards the centre and to the US and that kind of thing, because of native speakerism, really, and the concept of authenticity having those connections. So in the book that Rob kindly showed earlier, I tried to present an alternative definition of authenticity. Now, when I say it's an alternative, it's not actually a new definition at all. In many ways, it's a kind of I'm trying to consolidate a lot of the previous definitions that were put forward by, for example, Henry Widdowson and Leo Van Leer and Michael Breen as well. And those people were saying that authenticity is not absolute, it's relative. So you can't just sort of take something from one context and put it into another context and keep the authenticity intact, because authenticity is contextually dependent, and it's relative, and it's a process as well. So you can't just say that a text has authenticity. So Widdowson said that you can have genuine texts, but he was quite cautious about how he used the word authenticity, and he often used the word authenticate to describe it as a process, really. So this is kind of what I've been trying to propose, but I turned it into a diagram and a continuum to basically to try and make it easier to understand, because there's 30 years of debate about what authenticity is, and I didn't think it was really being applied when teachers talk about authenticity in the classroom, in the staff room, they'll tend to be using this classic definition, despite decades of scholars arguing against doing so. I think.
Okay. Well, so we've outlined there our definitions of native speakerism and authenticity, and now we'll look to the theoretical framework that we constructed in the article that we co-wrote. So the first thing we'll do, the article or the framework is divided into two sections. The first one is the kind of the theoretical side of things. So we'll talk about these three things that we think are kind of quite key in the idea of employing the connections between native speakerism and authenticity.
Right.
Yeah. So there are three points that are all kind of connected and lead on from one another: authority, culturism, and cultural capital.
Yeah.
So authority really means the kind of speaking with an authoritative voice. I think this is what you've written about in your work as well. Right?
Yeah, and so has Henry Widdowson actually connected authority to authenticity, and actually the auth part of authority is it's the same as the auth part of the word authenticity. They have
and author
and autonomy. So aut in that AUT just means self, but authority and authenticity are have a close etymological link. So they're sort of very closely related concepts historically, And yeah, if something's authentic, or if somebody is authoritative, yeah, they have a certain amount of power in that sense. So yeah, authority is really just about having a kind of power or ownership over the language.
So in this case, it would be the institutions of the West, and by West we mean the kind of the Anglo-American world.
Yeah.
So the institutions of that world, the groups like the British Council or universities or these or publishers, I guess, OUP, CUP,
Yeah,
that kind of
certainly,
thing.
yeah, publishers as well.
So all of these people are invested with authority when it comes to defining the English language and defining things like the best ways of teaching the English language.
Yeah.
And then the so-called native speakers are kind of seen as the representatives of those institutions and are invested with that authority.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, authority. Yeah, basically this idea that of power, and obviously that leads to discrimination and imbalances of power.
And
so,
particularly leads to culturism.
Yes.
So again, we've got another ism here. There's isms all over the place. But culturism it's connected to the idea of cultural disbelief. So Adrian Holiday talks about cultural disbelief, the idea that so-called non-native speakers, non-Western speakers of English don't have anything to offer to the language teaching profession.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And culturism it's a kind of cultural chauvinism. The idea that the West is best, I guess. That people from the West and institutions from the West have the kind of authority and the cultural knowledge and the cultural we're going to talk about, but the cultural capital to define what the English language is, to define how it should be taught.
Yeah, and they tend to have a rather blinkered view and not to know well about whatever culture they're transferring knowledge or technology into.
Yes.
And this is why I chose this picture from the Stanley Kubrick film, because I want you to use the word monolithic, and that stone is a monolith. So
culturism, one aspect of culturism is defining non-Western cultures in monolithic ways, as you said, right?
As you said in our paper.
And an example of this is there was a paper by Susser from I think 1998 in the JALP journal, and he looked at these materials which are given to teachers coming to Japan for the first time, and they're meant to prepare people for living in Japanese culture and for working in a Japanese environment. But he found that they were just basically constructed from stereotypes and from these monolithic representations of culture. So culturism, it's defining cultures as one big monolithic thing, and then also defining them in opposition to the West.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's this sense that it's, as you were saying, that it's kind of set in stone and very difficult to change. And whereas obviously culture is fluid and constantly, evolving, and so that it kind of gives a false presentation of culture as well within it.
Yeah.
So shall we move on to the next slide?
Yeah. And so the final conceptual connection that we identified was cultural capital.
Oh yes, and on the slide you can see a picture of the Queen.
Why did you choose a picture of the Queen?
Well, because quite a few people have come to my classes and said to me, "Oh, you're English, so that's great because I want to learn the Queen's English." And well, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't speak like the Queen because I'm from the north of England, and I speak with a Yorkshire accent. Well, I just tried to make it more pronounced just then, but I think that the Queen is a good representation of cultural capital because people think that they want to speak like the Queen.
Well, cultural capital, I think, just to define it, it's from the work of Pierre Bourdieu.
Yes. Bourdieu talks about lots of different linguistic capital and cultural capital, social capital. He basically applies a kind of economics to sociology, and this idea that capital basically means money, but in this sense it means
Resources?
not money, but resources, power, currency in some sense. So you have the more you have, the more resources you can get access to. So if you've got cultural capital, it means that you're going to be respected in society, that you're going to have access to slightly more privileged resources. But anyway, and also there's another picture there behind the Queen is Cambridge University. So again, if you graduate from Cambridge, then that instantly means that when people say, "Oh, where did you go to university?" "Oh, Cambridge," then you're going to have you're going to be treated a slightly different way because it's got more cultural capital than, say, for example, Leeds University, where I graduated from. Although Leeds isn't bad at all, and but it's this idea that you kind of purchase for yourself certain privileges through having a cultural capital.
Yeah, and this connects to the idea of culturism, because what we're, with culturism, you've got certain cultures, non-Western cultures, being presented in monolithic ways and devalued, having their currency, their capital devalued, and the cultures of the West, in terms of the English language, having their currency increasing in value. And the result of that is you see people who want to be language teachers, who want to learn English, travelling to the West, imbuing the Western institutions with financial capital, with actual capital. And that's
perpetuating this kind of dichotomy.
Absolutely. And so I did a study which was published last year, where I analysed different university departments in Japan with equal numbers of, or nearly equal numbers of, Japanese staff and foreign staff. And what I found was that even though in Japan most universities have, or many kind of liberal arts universities have, English language teaching master's courses, the majority of the foreign teachers, the Japanese teachers, all had their qualifications from British or American or Australian institutions.
Centre.
Yeah, I called it centre qualification bias.
Yeah.
And so this is, I think, a very clear example of all of these 3 points: authority, culturism, and cultural capital coming together. So you've got the authoritative voices of these people in the West. Then using those voices to present other cultures as these monolithic entities and devaluing them, whilst kind of increasing the cultural capital, or the cultural the cultural goodness stuff.
Cultural capital.
Well, I guess increasing the respect and the authority,
social standing,
the social standing of their own of Western institutions, which then leads to people seeking out training in these Western institutions as a way of getting, as a way of accessing the cultural capital which they believe resides there. And I think Suresh Kanagaraja in 2012 wrote an autoethnography where he described his life as a teacher, and part of that involved, like he said, that he was teaching a class in Sri Lanka, and these kind of Western experts came and watched his class and were very highly critical. And afterwards, he went and asked his colleagues, what can I do to stop people how can I learn the correct way of teaching English? And they told him, well, if you want to learn English, or if you want to learn the correct way of teaching English, you need to go and seek out this knowledge in the West, because that's where it is.
Yeah, he was basically told that he needed to go and get a qualification from the centre, from the US in this case. And it's really difficult, because if you are if you're in, I can understand as well, if you want to rebel against that, or if you disagree with it, then you're going to be setting yourself up for prejudice, because there's a lot of if you do go and get one of these centre qualifications and go back to your country, then the reality is that it probably will help you to get a better job.
Mm.
And so it's very hard to sort of react and to affect positive change in this case, because it's so widely believed that if you try to go against it, then you're going to be putting yourself into a lower position really in society.
Yeah.
But it's bizarre because just the other day I was having a conversation with a colleague at the university where I work, and we both have our master's degree from a university in London, and he was saying that he thinks that the master's degree program we run at our university in Japan is actually better because there are fewer students on it, and so each student gets more attention from the teacher, and most of the people on the course, it's an MA in ELT and Applied Linguistics. Most of the people on the course have experience and are practicing teachers, so it's very practically oriented, although it's obviously Applied Linguistics and it's an MA, so it's got plenty of theory as well. And he was just saying it's a great course to teach on, and the quality of it is very high. And yet, unfortunately, I think I have a lot of respect for the students who are on that kind of program, because I think that's the way that it should be going. We shouldn't be leaving our countries to get educations abroad, so that we can come back to our country and say, oh look, I've got a better, higher class degree because it's not from this country. I mean, that's not very patriotic, is it? And it's also, I mean, it's sort of the very negative face of globalization, really.
Yeah.
So but it's hard to change that kind of thing.
Yeah, but identifying it is, I think, the first step along the road to change, which is what we've tried to do.
Yeah, we're trying to change the world, make it a bit better with our paper and our video.
Yes.
We really are. Yeah. We don't like prejudice.
No.
We don't like discrimination.
No, even when we're receiving either the prejudice or the discrimination.
Yeah, and I do feel that as someone who has, I'll admit, I have experienced a lot of privilege because of these inconvenient labels of native speaker and non-native speaker. I have benefited from that, so I feel like it's really my job, my responsibility to do what I can to speak out against it.
Yeah. So those are the connections in theory that we talk about in the paper.
It nicely links to the practical ones now, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah. So we'll move on to talk about connections in practice. We have 4 particular connections in practice which we identified. We're not saying that these are the only connections in practice. In fact, we're not saying that the theoretical connections we identified are the only ones either. They just happen to be the ones that we've identified in our framework, the ones that make sense to us.
The ones we felt we could write about.
Yes,
but there will be many other types of connection.
And if you watching this have your own ideas, or if you think we've got something wrong about that, then feel free to write your own ideas down.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sure people will be keen to write in the YouTube comments all kinds of critical things about us.
Yes, mainly our faces and so on.
Yes, I really should have shaved before coming today.
Yeah. Well, the 4 connections in practice that we identified are first, professional discrimination, which is perhaps the best known. Then perceptions and discrimination from students, negative self-images of non-native speaker teachers, and finally, sales rhetoric and representation. I should know, I meant to say this earlier, but when we use the term native and non-native, as we've identified these terms as being social constructs and not realities, we're saying them with inverted commas around them.
Yeah.
So
every time I say the word native speaker, just imagine me doing this.
Yeah.
I don't really believe that it's a real thing.
We're using the terms as they would be used in the ideology of native speakerism. So whatever people would mean when they use the term native speaker, that's what we're talking about, without saying that these are value-free labels in and of themselves. So if we look,
we should put that bit right at the beginning of this video.
So the first connection in practice that we'll talk about is professional discrimination, and Do you want to talk about this first?
Yes, and we kind of touched upon it a little bit when we talked about cultural capital. So, because people will get professional discrimination, especially if English is your second language and you've learned it, then you might be discriminated against if you try to get a job as a language teacher, as anyone on the TEFL Equity website will know and will have had first-hand experience of, and knows a lot better than I did probably as well. And so faced with discrimination, people will naturally seek to find other ways of gaining cultural capital, and which means that they'll tend to, as we were saying, try and do a master's degree at a university in the West or in the centre, in order so that they can go and gain some of the cultural capital, which if you are born and you learn English as your first language, you're likely to already have a certain amount of that cultural capital already. There's just so much discrimination in job adverts. It's illegal in many countries to write the word "we're looking for a native speaker" in your job adverts. It's illegal in Japan. But no, it still happens. In fact, there's one on the next slide. Oh no, there isn't.
No, there is on the next slide.
There is on the next slide.
Yeah.
So this is professional discrimination. Sorry, I've started talking about professional discrimination when we should be just talking about discrimination in general.
That's okay. That's fine.
But so this was when we did the web webinar originally in February. Was it February?
I think so.
It was quite a long time ago. It's October now.
Much has happened since then.
Yeah, much has happened, but not much has changed, unfortunately. So I took this advert from from Facebook, and this person who actually himself has learned English as a second language was saying that his university in Tokyo is looking for must be a native speaker. And this is a classic kind of job advert. This isn't an official formal job advert. But clearly that's the kind of thing. And even if you apply for a job which has not used the word native speaker, you're still going to be faced with this discrimination, because that's what a lot of schools think they want.
Yeah, or they use a proxy term like native-like.
Yeah,
which means white.
Yeah,
basically.
it often does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are many studies showing that there's a huge amount of discrimination against people in terms of finding jobs.
Racial discrimination, not just linguistic.
Yes, yeah. And this research has been conducted all over the world. It does slightly depend what kind of job you're talking about. If you're talking about language schools, then yes, absolutely. It's all shifts in one direction. But I think it was Enrique Yerda who pointed out that if you're applying for example, high school jobs, teaching at high schools, then the discrimination very much goes in the opposite direction. It's very difficult for someone who is not a national of a country to get that kind of job in the public school system. So it does somewhat depend on the kind of job that you're going for, but overall there is a lot of professional discrimination. And there are certain types of jobs that really are only open to the so-called native speakers.
Yeah, and I think it's as you were saying, it's reductive to say that native speakers are getting all the best jobs, because that's certainly not the case, and it's a two-way street. But certainly within the discussions that I've been reading about on, for example, TEFL, it seems to be this kind of feeling that it's easier for someone who's a native speaker to get a job, and they can just pack their bag and go travelling around the world and get paid for doing it, and that's quite unfair, because if you're a good teacher, then you should be recognised wherever, and it shouldn't matter where you're from. And some people have tried to make me think of it in a different way by saying, oh, okay, imagine it's reversed. Imagine you're trying to hire a Japanese language teacher. Yeah, I don't mean to buy one, obviously. I mean to hire a Japanese language teacher. And would you imagine two people send their CV and one's Korean, and one's Japanese, but they both speak fluent Japanese. Which would you pick? And of course, well, I would always choose the one who's the best teacher.
Yeah, I always said actually the best Japanese teacher I ever had was a Korean.
Yeah, and actually the best conversation I ever had in Japanese was with a man from the Congo, the Republic of Congo. We met in our Japanese class. That was such a great Japanese class because we were using Japanese as a lingua franca. I had the best conversation with this man from the Congo, as I said, because his Japanese was roughly the same level as mine, so we were teaching each other as we said things because we knew that, oh, you might not know this word, so I'll explain it. And also, I wasn't afraid of making any mistakes, whereas when I speak with Japanese people, I'm quite often conscious of making mistakes, even though I tell my own students in my classes, don't worry about making mistakes. But I can't quite do it myself, because I don't, again, because of cultural capital, I suppose, and I don't want people to laugh at me, and I don't want to lose face if I make a grammar mistake. But I didn't care when I talked to this other man because he was also a learner. So you had your best Japanese teacher you ever had was Korean.
Yes, yeah. So she was a South Korean, obviously. Well, maybe not obviously, but so she,
more likely anyway.
Right. Yeah. And she'd come to Japan and was working as a language teacher and had learned Japanese as a second language. She wasn't a Zainichi. She wasn't a Korean by nationality, but born in Japan, which is quite a big kind of subgroup. No, she was she'd learned Japanese as a second language and was teaching as a second language, and because of that, because she had learned Japanese as a second language, she was much more aware of the kind of difficulties that I would have, and a lot more forgiving of the mistakes I was making as well. She knew what mistakes were obvious, or what mistakes I was likely to make, and what mistakes I wasn't. And I thought that, compared to the other teachers I had, she was an excellent teacher. So, I've had the same question posed to me, and for some reason I always use Japan as the example, as if Japan's like this weird place. Yeah, it is. But if when people put that question to me, it's very easy to answer because in my experience, the better teacher's the better teacher. Yeah.
In my case, I have to theoretically assume I would choose the best teacher, but it's great that you've actually had that, because that's often a very good way of thinking about it, to sort of imagine if it was you choosing. And I think anyone who would say, oh no, I will choose the native speaker of whatever language, those people don't really want to learn the language properly. They just want to have the experience of talking to someone, and that doesn't happen. Yeah. Which kind of brings us on to the student discrimination, or the perceptions and discrimination from students. Yes. This is one reason why so-called non-native speaker teachers might face trouble getting positions, because the institutions believe that the students want a native speaker.
Which is actually not correct. So there's a lot of research that's been done relatively recently, I'd say in the last 15 years or so, showing that students, when given the chance or given the option between having a native speaker or a non-native speaker, and a qualified teacher or a non-qualified teacher, they'll go for a qualified non-native speaker over an unqualified native speaker any day, though they will quite often still say they prefer a qualified native speaker over a qualified non-native speaker.
Well, hopefully that kind of thing will change.
Yeah.
But I remember a presentation by Patrick who's from Singapore, who works in a university in Japan. Does he work in Nagoya?
I can't remember.
Anyway, a very nice chap, and he talks about his experience as a Singaporean coming to Japan as a language teacher. And he says that at first, he experienced quite a lot of discrimination, but luckily his university was really keen to have a kind of really truly international version of English. They didn't want this kind of fake international Anglo-American global version of international English, which is very pervasive around the world. They actually really wanted it to be international. So that's why one of the reasons he was actually kind of chosen to work at that university, because he was Singaporean and therefore truly an international speaker of English. And so he said he did experience a bit of professional discrimination at first, but then his students told him, that they loved his class because it was truly international. He would look at, and he would talk about Singapore. We'd also talk about other countries as well, that where English is spoken as a second language or an official language, and it made them feel better about themselves as speakers. And that's something I try to do, but I feel like it's hard for me to do because I'm often viewed as a native speaker, and so in that sense, I think that Patrick has and people like him who are really embody the international status of English. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I saw, or we both saw actually, a presentation in Hiroshima by Monica.
Oh yeah, that was good.
Yeah, we interviewed her for the podcast. So if you're interested in hearing more of her story, please go and listen to that. But she was talking about how she was hired as a native speaker, basically like answering to one of these job ads for native speakers.
Yeah.
But she actually is. Do you remember which country she's from?
She's from Czech Republic,
somewhere like that. So somewhere in Eastern Europe. But she began learning English when she was 19. So very far into adulthood.
Yeah.
And she does speak English absolutely perfectly, much better than I do, as evidenced by this webinar. But the way that she got the job was basically by lying, by saying that she by not mentioning, by omitting her nationality, and just and the people not knowing that couldn't tell. They couldn't tell where she was from.
Yeah.
And they couldn't tell what her first language was, and so she got the job. But why would it be an issue in the first place then? If there's no way to tell, it's an ideological position, I think.
Interestingly as well, like when I listen to, for example, Arnold Schwarzenegger talking, he's really got quite a strong Austrian accent, despite having lived in the United States for so long. But that's one of the
Henry
things.
Kissinger.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I really love about Arnie. I love the way he talks English with the Austrian accent. It's part of his identity. It's a lovely sound. And yet, when I showed videos of different speakers to my class in Japan, this is some research I did. A lot of the students thought that Arnold Schwarzenegger is a native speaker because he lives in England. He lives in the US, and he was the governor of California. So they didn't know that he wasn't that he'd learned English, and they couldn't hear his accent, even though it's quite pronounced to me. I think many learners are unable to distinguish between accented English and so-called standard varieties.
Yeah, so I think there's definitely a misconception that learners want native speakers. Research shows that that's not true. These anecdotes also show that that's not true. And even if it were true, that isn't a reason to do it.
No.
Because that there's lots of discrimination that we're not allowed to indulge in, even though certain businesses would benefit if you did indulge in it, but you don't do it because it's wrong. It's wrong fundamentally. Yeah. So I think this is one of the key connections between the idea of authenticity and native speakerism.
Yeah.
But it does bring us on to the next point. It's very connected to the next point, which is negative self-images of non-native speaker teachers. So there is again a strand of research which looks into this, and it shows that non-native speaker teachers do often have these negative self-images, negative ideas of themselves, feel that they are in some way inferior to their native speaker colleagues. And even when they've been on certain training courses where these issues are raised, they still retain the negative self-images. I think it's probably very strongly connected to the idea that's been put into their heads that students want this.
Yeah.
And
it's connected to authenticity as well. If you've learned English and you might not feel that you're an authentic speaker if the concept of authenticity so heavily gravitates towards the native speaker. So it was Enric Yoder who kind of talks about self-discrimination within non-native speaker teachers. And I did a little bit of research as well with a teacher training course that I teach, and I asked I explained about the authenticity continuum and tried to present authenticity as something that needs to be conceptualized in a way that embraces international varieties of English, and I identifies authenticity as individual and socially created process, which tries to avoid being culturist. And anyway, so after the presentation, I collected reaction papers from all the participants, and one person whose quote is on the slide at the moment, who I'll call Momoko, said that before the workshop she just thought authentic meant native speakers, but after having learned about the concept of authenticity and opened it up a little bit, she felt less negative about herself as a teacher. So I think it's really it's really difficult not to prejudice against yourself as well if you have a kind of inferiority complex because of these powerful powerful institutions and powerful currents that kind of gravitate towards the center, gravitate towards native speaking varieties and standard varieties. And I think that's actually quite hard to fight against, really, as well.
Yeah, but I think, again, raising awareness of these issues is an important step forwards.
Yeah.
But this leads us on again. These points are all connected. This leads us on to the final practical connection that we identified between native speakerism and authenticity, which is sales rhetoric and representation.
Yeah.
So as you can see on the screen, this is an ad again from Nova, which in Japan it feeds into a lot of these different myths. But you can see they're highlighted. If you can't read Japanese, it's maybe a little bit difficult to see, but it says all of our instructors are foreigners, and then next to that it says native speaker. So obviously connecting the idea of foreign to native, and this idea of using the native speaker to sell courses is a very common one. There's been a couple of examples, in fact, where they've used. You have an example here. Okay.
Well, Rob hasn't seen this example yet, so why don't you keep talking? Because this is actually maybe not connected to what you're going to say.
Oh no, I think it is. It seems like it is.
So, well, go on. What were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to say that the idea of the native speaker, and particularly images of sort of Caucasian people, is used to, these things are used to sell English courses, to sell English schools, even to sell the international departments of universities. And international, you'd think international really means international, like lots of different countries, different backgrounds, things like that. But in fact, international seems to be in these advertisements. This is something we're researching at the moment. It seems to be connected to white people, to native speakers. So international, global, very often seems to be connected to the idea of the native speaker.
Yeah. What's interesting about this advert, by the way, and I haven't had a chance to show you this, Rob, is this is actually it's an advert for Ryugaku, which is study abroad, and look at the country that's been advertised, Rob. It's the Philippines.
Philippines, yeah.
And what I found this really interesting, because in Japan at the moment there's a bit of a kind of, well, study abroad to the Philippines is becoming quite popular as a cheaper alternative than going to a country such as the United States or the UK. And this is a kind of classic example of it. So because the Philippines is closer, it's cheaper, but also because it's not a centre variety, it's cheaper as well.
But it is very close to a centre variety.
Yes, exactly. So it's a kind of bargain way of getting this kind of experience of going abroad and improving your English. And usually it never would put the price on one of these things, I don't think, but it puts the price here. It's 100,000 yen for 4 weeks.
Mm.
That is cheap.
That's like £500
Yeah.
or less.
For,
Thanks Brexit.
for a month of for 4 weeks of intensive study abroad, and that's all inclusive. You know, that's all the fees. So it's really, really cheap because it's in the Philippines. Whereas, and there's another similar situation in my local town. I'm always looking around my local area, and there is different schools, and there's the Nova School where all their speakers are native speakers, as it says, and their prices are much higher than the school where there's a Filipino couple working, and they just teach from their own house.
Mm.
But you know, of course, they can't charge as much because people wouldn't. You know, they can't be competitive with the Nova School because for the wrong reasons. Their variety of English, or because they're not from the centre exactly, they have to reduce their prices, which is just terrible, really. Why can one person get paid more at a job because of where they're from?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me that this is advertising an English course in the Philippines, and they're still using a white guy with an afro
Yeah, exactly.
to advertise it. Like, what?
He doesn't look like he's from the Philippines, that guy.
But he might be, because
He
this
could
is
be.
a global age. He
Yeah.
could be. We don't know.
But he probably isn't. Yeah, let's face it. Yeah.
Actually, if you're interested in the history of English in the Philippines, look up the Thomasites. They're very, very interesting.
That was in one of your podcasts, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. It's a story
that was an interesting one.
of murder, headhunting. It's great. So sales rhetoric and representation is the final of the four practical connections
That we've identified.
Yes,
But
and again,
certainly there'll be many more.
yeah, absolutely. So to conclude this little webinar, I'll pass over to Richard, who's got a quote here. Who it doesn't matter how many times you explain to me why you chose this, I still don't really understand.
Yeah,
So-
I hope I understand now, because it was a while since the webinar. But I chose this quote from Abraham Lincoln, who says that if I had 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend the first 4 hours sharpening the axe.
Yeah.
So I think that really what he's talking about is being prepared and having an understanding of the task that's ahead of you. You know, you can't start making changes unless you really understand the problems. And so I really feel like we're currently just sharpening the axe to chop down this tree of prejudice. And I think we can do it. I think that, you know, in time we'll be able to so not within the world necessarily. It would be nice if we could eliminate prejudice from the world, but we're just trying to work it within the ELT industry at first.
Yeah.
But I think that we're sharpening the axe, and I think that lots of people are involved in this process of getting ready to cut down this tree. And for example, the plenary at TEFL this year,
Sylvana Richardson.
fantastic plenary. I couldn't be there, and you weren't there either. were
No,
you?
but I saw the video.
Yeah, luckily it was video recording. I watched the video, and actually I was very moved by that video. And I know people in the audience were moved to tears. The lady who did the podcast for you,
Sandy Millen.
yeah, she said that she had tears in her eyes, and there must have been a great atmosphere. I mean, the fact that Sylvana was asked to do that plenary, and the fact that I think that there's TEFL Equity website now, and that there's a lot more movement towards trying to get rid of this, trying to fix this problem. A lot more research going on.
Yeah.
So I think I think we're currently getting a good understanding of the problem, and from that position we'll be able to really
Cut down the tree.
cut down the tree.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point to make, because with this kind of theoretical side of things, people might look at what we're talking about here and say, well, what's the point of all this? Isn't this just hot air? You know, we've got real issues, and for example, TEFL Equity Advocates does a really important job in doing things like letter writing campaigns to schools that are doing discriminatory hiring policies, and that's very, very important. You know, the activism side of things is very important.
Yeah.
But I think unless you can understand, identify, and tackle the root causes of these things, then they just pop up under a different name. So, for example, universities and schools stopped in Japan have largely stopped advertising for native speakers, but then they've just changed the wording to a native level of proficiency or whatever, which basically means the same thing. So, even if you can change things, unless you identify the root of the problem and try to solve things from there, the problem really isn't necessarily going to go away.
Yeah.
And I think that's why this kind of analysis is needed.
Yes, yeah, I agree. That's why I chose that quote.
Oh, there you go. I understand. So if you're interested in learning more about this, obviously there's our paper which is out, and it's free to access online. We've also got some further reading here, including, I'll hold it up again, Richard's book. Buy this. I got a free copy today, so I don't need to buy it. But chapter 4 is really good, so please buy that. And we have some other references up on the screen, which you can go and check out.
Yes, please do. Yeah, and also write your own papers and cite us if you don't mind.
Yeah,
we'll return the favour. But yeah, I hope that you've managed to sit through this video, or at least if you're skipping through, you found the good bits and not the bad bits. And thank you very much for your time listening to us. And we hope to be able to come back to TEFL Equity for another live webinar, which will hopefully involve some participation as well. But if you want to participate in this discussion, then please do use the comments that will be below the video. And we'll try to keep checking them and add our opinions as well. And you can always email me as well if you want to get in touch.
Or email either of us.
No, just email me, don't email me.
I reply.
I'm quite bad at replying sometimes. I get a lot of emails. Yeah. What are we saying about it's not useful? This is really hot air.
Yeah, it's authentic though. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.
To stay up to date, follow TEFL Equity on social media. We're on Twitter at TEFL Equity, on Google+, on YouTube, and on Facebook. You can also visit the website for free resources such as lesson plans, webinars, and blog posts. And you can also support the campaign for equal professional and employment opportunities for native and non-native speakers.